Compass FM, and with me in the studio here at Compass FM, I've got Chris Hurring. Now, Chris is a family protection officer here in North Canterbury with the police, of course, and we also have Celine Donovan. Now, Celine is with Women's Refuge North Canterbury, a victim specialist, and today's topic, it's pretty heavy stuff. It is sexual violence, and I would like to start with you, Celine, if I could. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Lovely to see you again. Celine, is this something that's sort of plateauing this, or are we seeing more and more sexual violence at the moment? And I'm going to ask you about porn shortly, which tells me that we could be seeing an increase. But where are we at?
I think sexual violence has always been an issue that's not talked about very much, even in relation to family violence. But we know some statistics came out of the Ministry of Justice this year that 94% of sexual violence is not reported, and you can understand why that is, because people feel deeply ashamed of it. Don't want to be talking to people about traumatic sexual experiences that they've had. So it's kind of a bit of a silent thing. If family violence is silent, sexual violence is far more hidden.
Okay. When we speak of sexual violence, are we speaking mainly about people in relationships?
Well, we are, because we're dealing with family violence, but sexual violence happens with strangers as well. But I think there's a myth that people that are experiencing sexual violence, it is a stranger. The vast majority of sexual violence occurs with people that people know.
Could you define what sexual violence actually means within a relationship?
So it may have a different meaning for police as far as criminal behaviour goes, but it's unwanted sexual behaviour. Touch, talking, anything that's unwanted is sexually abusive, and it has significant effects on people.
Okay. It's difficult for me to comprehend violence in terms of sex, but in fact it is now very common, and you were telling me off air that since violent porn has become so prevalent now and so easily available, in sort of the last 10 years we are now seeing an increase in reality, yeah?
Yes, yeah, with very violent sexual violence. But just, in our history, we have a culture where sexualised behaviour towards women is normal. People have thought that, the clothes that a woman wears means that she's asking for sex, and we know that clothing isn't consent. I think that the statistics around that is that 85% of women have experienced unwanted sexual harassment, and that's actually a society problem and a culture problem within our country. So, of course, that's going to transfer to relationships, around, and that's shown within the law too. It only became illegal to rape within marriage in 1985. Prior to that, there was no protection for women around sexual violence unless there was physical violence involved as well. So we have got a long way to go. There's a lot of victim blaming towards women if they are sexually violated. What was she wearing? What was she doing? Why was she drunk? That kind of thing. You see that in the media. So there's a lot of shame and a lot of issues related to that for the people that are experiencing sexual violence. But yeah, we want people to know that anything that they feel uncomfortable about sexually, it would be really good to talk to someone who has some knowledge around these things, and there's some really good support services available for people around sexual violence.
Well, obviously, Celine, you are there to help and to protect women. That's what Women's Refuge is all about. Chris Hurring, who is a family protection officer here in North Canterbury. What is the police role when it comes to sexual violence, Chris?
Good afternoon. So obviously police are involved in the investigation and possible prosecution of this type of offending. But from our unit that we work in relation to family protection, sexual violence flows into the work we do around family violence, and there may be situations where the victim of the family violence has also been a victim of sexual violence, and we need to deal with the bigger picture around things, and it may well be that it goes unreported to us, and we have to deal with the situation and keep the situation as safe as possible for these families across the broad aspect of family violence. Like Celine said, 94% goes unreported to us, and then the small percentage that is reported to police the chances of a prosecution is actually reasonably slim. Personally, I'd like to see that increased. I'd like to see more accountability for this type of offending. So the first step with that is victims being able to feel comfortable to come and talk to police, to disclose this type of offending to police with a view to an investigation taking place. That can be done with the assistance of agencies like Celine's and Women's Refuge and the support they give to women. But there's two separate things here. I mean, obviously, Women's Refuge are supporting the woman, the victim, but then there's the prosecution side of things that police are obviously involved in. They can work together, but they can also work separately to keep families safe.
Chris, in terms of the police, it's a shocking statistic that around 95% goes unreported. How is it reported to police? Usually by the victim themselves or someone the victim knows? Or
it can be both ways. Quite often what we find is that something else has occurred within the family. There's other violence that's occurred. And then during our involvement with these victims, the question is asked of them, have you ever been the victim of sexual violence? And sometimes it needs to be talked about more deeply as to, what does this offending look like for them to even realise themselves, perhaps, because it might be normalised within the relationship, for them to realise that they're actually the victim of sexual violence as well within the relationship, as well as whatever emotional, psychological, physical violence that's also occurred. So, I mean, from our perspective, we would like to have reports come to us so that we can do our job and look at offending within the law. But obviously, we're also about safety and the wellness of families to keep them safe and lead a happy and fulfilling life. I mean, that's what we all want in life. And if it's purely about assisting a person to get out of a relationship that might be violent, then we've achieved something if we're assisting safely to do that with families.
How common is rape within marriage? It's very hard to determine, I suppose, but Celine?
I think it's pretty common, although we probably, when I was speaking to a woman, I wouldn't be using those words because that can be quite triggering and people have a view of what rape is and what it isn't. I'd be talking more about consent. But I should say too, we've been talking about women and we know that women are by vast the majority of victims within intimate partner relationships, but men also experience sexual violence as well. So consent, people probably think it's a yes or a no. It's actually not. It's an enthusiastic yes, and that requires energy and action to go along with that to give consent. You can't give consent when you're drunk, and there's a significant amount of sexual violence that occurs when people are not actually in a position where they're able to actually consent. So there's quite a lot of stuff around consent that is learning for people. There's some really good websites around that. There's a really excellent little video that we like. So if you Google cup of tea and consent, you'll see a little video about consent that explains it really clearly, and that's worth a watch. Yeah.
That sounds like a very good tool. So could you just repeat that? It's called a cup of tea video around consent. So if you just Google consent and cup of tea, you'll see, and it really clearly illustrates how ridiculous it is to force a cup of tea on someone, and it relates it to sexual abuse. Yep. Getting back to you, Chris, from the police point of view, the point of view of law, in terms of sexual violence within relationships, rape within relationships, just how successful are police in actually getting a prosecution?
I don't have the statistics at hand, and I wouldn't even like to guess. But the stats compared to what we know of the offending that's occurring out there are very low as it relates to a successful prosecution. But I'll reiterate what I said before around it's not necessarily from our perspective to purely look at a prosecution. It's about trying to make people safe within relationships and and lead a happy and fulfilled life, and not live within an environment of sexual and violence and abuse.
With you.
It's to think about it positively. It's about recovering and healing and not experiencing that. So you wouldn't want it to be a barrier for people to, if they